Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 5. So, this will be the lecture to accompany our discussion of classroom based assessments. We'll be talking about classroom assessments, and these are often more informal assessments. So, these are not standardized or norm reference tests like the Wyatt that we'll be learning to give this semester, but these are more locally developed, classroom friendly, informal measures of student achievement. Some benefits to these informal classroom assessments are that they often provide teachers and educational teams with information about the student's current status or their performance. So, where a standardized achievement test like the Wyatt or even like one of the Common Core assessments that might be administered at the state or district wide level, it may give us a good general idea of the student's functioning or their achievement. Um, More locally developed informal assessments can provide us with much more specific information about how the child is performing on a specific skill or in relation to a curricular expectation. So it does give us a little bit more specific information about the skills that the child does and does not have. It can also be very helpful in informing our intervention practices because it can let us know if the child is gaining skills in response to intervention. So, those are some of the benefits or the pros of classroom based assessment versus a standardized achievement test. We'll be talking a little bit about comparing classroom assessments and norm referenced assessments. We'll talk about these five main points here, including some differences in the standard of reference, some technical considerations, some efficiencies, some specificity, and some of the different examiner qualifications, and just kind of talking about the pros and the cons and the nuances of each type of test. So, again, remembering that those classroom assessments, we're talking about informal types of assessments. They can be developed by teachers. They can go along with different curriculum or different textbooks. And norm referenced assessments, we're typically talking more about tests that are administered and are manufactured by a test publisher or a test manufacturer. Those could again include things like statewide or district-wide achievement tests or individual achievement tests like the Wyatt, the Woodcock-Johnson, the KTEA. Those are a couple other examples. So one of the most distinct differences in between norm referenced and classroom-based assessments has to do with this idea of the standard of reference of the test. So the standard of reference just typically refers to what the test measures or compares the child's achievement against. A norm reference test would obviously compare the child's achievement to the achievement of children or people in the normative group or the normative sample. Excuse me. So, test publishers will administer that test or that measure to a variety, a large sample of people, and that will provide a norm group or a normative reference, normative sample. And when we administer the test to an individual child, we compare his or her achievement or performance against that of the normative sample. And that allows us to compare the child's achievement to the achievement of other students in the normative group. And norm reference tests most commonly report what is called a standard score and a percentile rank. And we'll talk more about that later on. But just be aware that standard scores and percentile ranks are relevant to norm reference tests, and they give us information about how the child performed in relation to other children in the normative sample. The standard of reference, however, for a classroom based or an informal assessment has much less technical adequacy in terms of the data or the normative comparison not being to a large norm group. Obviously, when something is developed by a teacher or developed in a more local, informal setting, we will be able to compare the child's achievement to his or her peers or to a curriculum standard or a criterion or even local norms like at the grade level or district level. So our ability to compare that child to other children is much smaller and is in a much more narrow focus than these norm reference tests that typically include a national sample of the child's same age or grade level peers. But again, the classroom based assessment does give us information about how the child is performing in relation to a specific skill, a curriculum standard, or their peers, locally at the grade or district level. I touched previously a bit on technical adequacy, but if you'll remember back to chapter 4, where we began talking about things like reliability and validity in tests, those are characteristics of technical adequacy. So, obviously, one of the drawbacks to using informal assessments are that they are informally developed, therefore, they're not tested or standardized. So we often don't have information about their reliability or validity. They're just, things that are informally developed and certainly not published and researched. The technical quality of these instruments is not necessarily poor, but it's just unknown. So it's a question mark. It could be quite good, but obviously we're not doing research studies on informally developed assessments, and so it's just really an unknown. One of the biggest considerations of that unknown technical adequacy of these informal assessments is just that it does have implications for making high stakes decisions for children, in that the technical quality of it, so the reliability, the validity, is unknown. And it's considered unfair and inappropriate to use an informal assessment result as the sole factor that would determine a high stakes decision for a child. So, an example of a high stakes decision would be something like special education eligibility, a change in placement, retention. So, you kind of get the idea of some of those high stakes types of decisions. And informally developed tests or assessments are a wonderful complement to a comprehensive evaluation to make those comprehensive or high stakes decisions. But in isolation, because of the technical adequacy concerns, they're not considered appropriate measures to be used independently or on their own. Talking a little bit about efficiency, we're talking about efficiency of both design and administration. In terms of the design, one thing that can be a drawback for informal assessments is that they do often have to be developed by the examiner or the administrator of the test. So, if a teacher or a district is developing and administering an informal assessment, they usually do have to create that evaluation. Again, there are some informal assessments that are provided or are part of different curriculum, and they would be developed for you. But that is one potential consideration, is just the length of time that it may take to initially develop the assessment. Whereas if you're using a standardized achievement test, it obviously comes prepackaged, the work is done for you, and there's no development required from the examiner or the evaluator. The administration of informal achievement tests is typically easier and much less time consuming than administering a standardized norm referenced assessment. So, again, those standardized norm reference assessments are tests like the Wyatt that we will be giving this semester. And one of the most common pieces of feedback that I get from students after they go through the Wyatt project is just how much time it took to give the Wyatt. And it's just really shocking to students sometimes how much investment of time it takes to work individually with the student and get the information that you're going after in a individual standardized test administration. So typically that is a benefit of these informal measures, is that it's easier and much less time consuming to administer this more informal evaluation. Another benefit and another nod to the efficiency of informal assessments is that the examiner qualifications are often much less for administering an informal assessment. So when we're talking about being able to administer a standardized achievement test like the Wyatt, it does require often years of training and multiple supervised administrations of those assessments to really gain fluency and proficiency in administering them. And then there's additional training involved in being able to score them and interpret them and understand what they mean. Using these informal assessments is much more accessible to a wider group of people. Certainly, instructors and all kinds of instructional staff, from intervention specialists to regular teachers to tutors, sometimes even volunteers or peer helpers can be trained to administer and understand simple informal assessments or evaluations. So that definitely has benefits in terms of just casting a wider net of folks that are able to participate in the gathering of information, and it can often be a little bit easier to understand this type of information. The next thing that I want to talk a little bit more about is the type of information that we gather from both norm referenced and informal assessments. So, one benefit of standardized norm referenced achievement tests are that they are great for measuring broad skills in large sections of the curriculum. So, these tests are great at giving us information about how a child is performing on an overall measure of reading, mathematics, or writing. They do break those areas down into sub skills such as reading fluency, reading comprehension, word attack skills, word recognition, math calculation, math problem solving, and some other types of sub skills. But generally, these tests provide more of an evaluation of how a child achieves on broad skills on global areas of the curriculum. Informal classroom based assessments often assess more specific skills, such as how a child is performing on multi digit addition or subtraction with regrouping, or two-step word problems or fractions or decimals. So instead of a broad area like math calculation, these types of assessments dial in even more specifically to sub-skills or specific areas. And they are very useful for teachers to monitor progress and to gather information to inform their instruction, to let them know if their students in their class or a specific child has really mastered a skill prior to moving on, or adding additional skills into the instruction. So standardized norm reference tests really are great for getting information about how a child performs in a broad area of the curriculum, but these informal classroom-based assessments are very beneficial in dialing down and getting more information about the child's performance or achievement. So, I previously touched a little bit on some of the examiner qualification considerations between these two types of tests. But obviously, when an evaluator or examiner is giving a standardized or norm reference test, whether that is an individual test or even examiners who administer these on a district or statewide level, there are always some type of requirements for being able to administer these standardized tests. So whether it's just being, briefed in a professional development circumstance to administer a statewide achievement test, all the way up to getting specialized supervised training and experience in giving a test like the Wyatt. There is training and an investment of time in learning how to give a standardized test. Informal classroom assessments obviously require far less formal training to administer, to score, and to interpret. They usually just require that the examiner is knowledgeable in the subject area that the test is measuring. So, whether that's math or reading or other areas in the curriculum, as long as that examiner is knowledgeable in the subject area, knowledgeable enough that they can both develop and administer and interpret the assessment results, they're usually good to go. Most instructional staff in schools certainly meets this criteria, and therefore informal assessments are much more accessible to a wider range of staff than a few specialized staff that might be available in an entire school building or even potentially in a district. So, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the specific types of classroom assessments that are available. One of the more interesting distinctions here are obtrusive versus unobtrusive tasks. I will refer you to your text for a more thorough explanation of obtrusive versus unobtrusive. The text goes into more detail than I go through in the lecture, and they also have some examples. But essentially, the difference is that obtrusive tasks will introduce a novel or a test task into the environment to evaluate a skill. They also might introduce a new person or a new variable to determine the impact that that has on the child's achievement. So definitely refer to your text for a more specific explanation and discussion of obtrusive versus unobtrusive classroom assessments. Same thing goes with the direct versus indirect assessment strategies, but the direct assessments do assess the characteristic directly, and indirect strategies gather information through an indirect source. So that could be through collecting work samples, through conducting interviews of staff, whereas a direct evaluation will specifically test or evaluate the characteristic, typically by administering some type of direct test or evaluation to the student versus gathering products or things that are just naturally available in the classroom environment. So definitely refer to your text for a more specific discussion and examples of the unobtrusive versus obtrusive and direct versus indirect types of classroom assessment. But that is a general overview of the distinctions. I also want to talk about the use of informants to gather information. So, a lot of times there is confusion about the terms informants and informal strategies. So, make sure when you're reading test questions, you are clear on that distinction. Make sure that you don't make that mistake of just reading it too quickly and misunderstanding the question or misinterpreting what the question is asking. We've spent a lot of time so far in the lecture talking about informal strategies, but using informant strategies is where we talk with people who can provide information about the student and his or her performance. So, an informant is a person, any person, who can provide you with information about the child and their achievement. So, informants may be tutors, intervention specialists, regular education teachers, parents, anybody that works with a child and has information about his or her performance. Again, remember that assessment is a broad term, so it could be information about their performance behaviorally, socially, academically. It really can be a broad scope of information that we gather. Again, I will refer you to your text for more specifics about these informant based strategies, but some examples of informant strategies of gathering test information or assessment information would be the use of checklists, rating scales, questionnaires, interviews. So, checklists are typically informally developed. Anecdotal checklists, I often refer to them as, where you'll just ask a teacher or a person who works with, is familiar with the child, to just endorse, if the child does or does not have various skills, maybe to rate the child's performance, achievement, skill level on a Likert scale. But checklists are typically a very informal way of gathering information from someone who is familiar with the child. Rating scales are kind of a standardized version of a checklist. So, rating scales do ask teachers, parents, informants to provide responses, but they are standardized questionnaires. So, rating scales will provide the evaluator with a standard score and a percentile rank based on the informant's responses. So, whereas a checklist or a questionnaire or an informal interview might just provide us with some information that would guide instruction and would inform our evaluation, the rating scale kind of quantifies and standardizes those responses and will give the evaluator information about that child's performance on those evaluation questions in relation to a normative sample. So the important thing to take away here is the distinction between informal and informant strategies. Remember, informal strategies are strategies that are just locally developed, casually developed, they're not standardized. Informant strategies are strategies of gathering information from people who have valuable information and insight about the child. So a strategy can be both informal and informant in the terms of administering a checklist, a questionnaire, conducting an interview. But be aware that rating scales are a way of gathering informant information and also having that standardized or quantified in a way that we would know information about the technical adequacy of that instrument. So, talking again about some of the considerations for this type of evaluation would be considerations of just any time we're interviewing people or we are relying on others to give their opinion or their recollection or in other ways provide information from their perspective about the child for the evaluation. So there are considerations including their ability to report accurately. It's kind of that old example of 5 people observing the same incident, like a car accident or other event, and having 5 different accounts of the same thing. Everyone has their own perspective, everyone has their own vantage point, and there could be, things associated with the individual's ability to perceive the information accurately, to recall it accurately. Sometimes we observe things and they're just very subjective, or we view things through our own lens. And sometimes we can give incomplete or inaccurate information, either knowingly or unknowingly. So these aren't reasons to not use informant strategies, but much like we talked about with the informal assessment strategies, we just need to consider these informant strategies in the context of other evaluations and other more technically sound assessments when we're making high stakes decisions. So kind of think through and maybe talk amongst yourselves about when it might be appropriate to use some of these strategies, what may be some benefits of getting information from informants, and when might that be most appropriate to utilize. But again, because of some of these considerations that we talked to that are just inherent in human error and human observation, informant strategies again would not be considered adequate alone to make a high stakes decision. Again, they're a great complement to a comprehensive evaluation. They provide some really important information for teams, but they are not considered technically adequate on their own as a standalone type of evaluation to make important or high stakes decisions for children. So observations are a really important strategy for gathering information. One of the most important things about conducting a good observation in the context of an assessment is to really clearly define the behavior that's being observed. So, a good behavioral definition is observable and measurable. Again, think broadly about this in terms of behavior, so it can have obvious implications for behaviors like out of seat or talking out or aggression or other types of classic behaviors, but it can also include things like positive behaviors, like students raising their hand to talk or students engaging in positive social interactions. It can even have academic implications, like a student beginning work after receiving an instruction or completing a familiar routine or performing specific math operations. So the behavior that you will be observing, again, can be very broad and can have both social, emotional, and academic um, importance. It's not just a behavior observation, it can be an academic operation as well. So the behavior needs to be observable, so it's easily detected by someone who is conducting the observation. So it needs to be defined in a way that the evaluator or the observer can clearly tell when the behavior is happening or when it's not. It also needs to be easily measurable so that the evaluator can easily count when the behavior is occurring or not occurring. Sometimes we count or measure behavior by measuring the frequency, counting how many times the behavior occurs or how many problems the child gets correct on an assignment. Sometimes we measure the length of time. So maybe how long a child is able to sustain attention or how long the child is able to sustain work on a task, or how long it takes a child between the time that a direction is given until he or she begins work on that task. So sometimes we're measuring in terms of counting frequency, sometimes we're measuring in terms of measuring or recording time and looking at the duration. So there is some flexibility or a variety of ways that we can measure or count the behavior, but it needs to fall under that category of being able to tell when it is or is not occurring so that we can apply the appropriate measurement strategy. Really, the gold standard for a good behavioral definition is that the definition would pass what's known as the stranger test. And this is when your behavioral definition is defined so well that even a stranger would be able to walk in who's unfamiliar with the child, unfamiliar with the situation. They would be able to read your behavioral definition and they would be able to accurately collect data about when the behavior is and is not occurring, and they would be able to collect accurate data for you as a stranger or a person who is unfamiliar with the setting, just based on reading your behavioral definition. So that's really the gold standard for a good behavioral definition. I wanted to touch a little bit on criterion reference tests. So these are tests that are unique in that they compare a student's performance to a curriculum standard. So this is where we're evaluating to determine if a child has mastered or acquired specific skills that are taught in a curriculum. So instead of comparing the child to other peers in a normative sample, or giving the evaluator information about how the child performs or achieves in relationship to other peers or other children of the same age or grade, this is letting the evaluator know if the child has mastered a skill. So this identifies what skills the child has and what skills the child does not have. It provides a good inventory of the child's skills. The emphasis here really is on mastery of certain criteria, mastery of specific goals, objectives. This would be scored as kind of a pass or fail. You either have the skill or you don't. And this can either be a published type of test that is more standardized or it is more commercially created and available. Again, these often come with certain curriculum that are out there. There will be different assessments or criterion reference measures that come with those so that teachers can evaluate the child's response to intervention. And teachers can also create their own version. So these are both published versions and informally teacher created versions. But the distinction of a criterion reference test is that it is kind of determining an inventory of what skills the child does and does not have. It doesn't really give us information about the level of mastery. It just tells us simply if they do or don't have that skill or have mastered that specific concept. So, some steps in creating a criterion reference test, if you would develop one of these on your own to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention or a curriculum, you would want to first determine and define what skill you want to test. You would write an objective. So you would establish what the student must do and create a criteria. You would specify under what conditions the child must perform. So this might specify if the child's able to receive visual supports or prompting, if they must do this independently. So it would just specify, what conditions. And so some of the considerations might be supports, prompting, or obviously other considerations, and how well the student must perform to pass. So if you're measuring, for instance, a child's mastery of a math concept, you would establish what is the level of passing to determine mastery, perhaps on a worksheet that you administer, or what score a child must obtain on a specific measure or probe that you give to them. So those are three important things. You have to determine what the child must do and set the criteria, specify the conditions for the child to achieve, and determine how well the student must perform to pass or for the skill to be considered mastered. When you create the test, you want to consider directions for administering and scoring, criteria for passing, and any materials necessary to administer the assessment or the evaluation. So diagnostic probes are a form of a criterion reference test, and this is where teachers will administer or will change an aspect of a task to determine if that has an impact on student performance. So we do this a lot in response to intervention to rule out environmental factors that may play a role in a student's achievement difficulties. So diagnostic probing is one way that we can systematically rule different things out or make changes to the environment or to the nature of a task demand to determine if that has a positive or negative impact on the child's achievement. So we want to see if we can change a relation, or if we can change a feature of the task demand, and if that will affect the student's ability to perform the task. Hopefully, we change it and it has a positive impact and the child's able to perform or achieve better. But if it doesn't and it goes the other way and it actually hinders their achievement, that gives us information as well too about the child's strengths and their needs and can help inform our instruction. So steps in designing a diagnostic probe or going about the diagnostic probe process would be to first get a baseline indicator of how the student is performing. So we would first assess the child or student's performance under normal instructional conditions. So before we make any changes, we really want to establish a baseline level of performance. Then we will modify an aspect of the task or the instructional conditions. So we might provide a different level of support. Maybe we add visuals. Maybe we add additional prompting. Maybe we reduce distractions. Maybe we provide extended time. Maybe we pre-teach some vocabulary before a lesson. We're just going to try something. So we're going to change something about the task or the instructional conditions, and then we will reevaluate the student's performance under those modified conditions, and we will determine if the change that we did or the modification had a positive or negative impact, or if it didn't have any impact at all on the student's performance. So this is a way to rule out environmental or task demand features that might impact a child's performance or achievement. It's important to do this systematically so that if the child does have a positive outcome, you are aware what caused that. If you change three or four things at once, it can be difficult to determine which of the changes was responsible for the positive outcome. So you have less specific information about what skills the child might need to work on. So this is a great strategy, but you just need to do it systematically. It's important to have an idea of the child's baseline achievement, and it's important to only modify one feature of the task or the instructional environment at a time. So just some ideas of features of the task demand that you can change when you're designing a diagnostic probe. Excuse me, you could change the response format for the student. So maybe instead of a written test, you allow the child to respond to the test orally. Maybe you allow them to type on the computer. Maybe you give them speech to text software. So maybe you just change up the way that the child responds to different questions. Maybe if they're a younger child, maybe they're working with pictures or they're matching things or, just otherwise changing the way that they respond to an assessment. Also, maybe changing the requirements for speed or accuracy and content. So maybe providing additional time or giving feedback about performance or simplifying the amount or the content that the child receives. So just making some adjustments for those factors to determine the impact on the child's achievement. Also, changing performance conditions, so reducing distractions, reducing the group size where the child takes the achievement, giving them a smaller group or an alternate location. And also changing how directions are presented. So maybe presenting directions one at a time, maybe presenting directions in written format or pairing them with a visual support. So these are just some ideas for things that can be changed or considerations that you might want to address as you are utilizing the diagnostic probe process to rule out environmental conditions that may be difficult for students. If you want to think through some of those possible modifications, go back to the previous slide and consider some of those characteristics that you could address through a diagnostic probe, and maybe just kind of sketch out some potential modifications that you could try on for size and see how they affect students. So, diagnostic teaching is a way to utilize diagnostic probes in the classroom that will systematically evaluate the effectiveness of two or more instructional techniques to help inform instruction. So, this is where a teacher administers instruction in one manner and then in another and monitors students' response to those efforts. So, again, much like designing the diagnostic probe itself, we start with identifying the baseline condition and the baseline level of performance. We would select a tool to evaluate performance, monitor the child's performance under the current conditions, implement one strategy at a time, and monitor the student's response. Implement the second strategy, continue to monitor response, and compare the data. So diagnostic teaching just talks about utilizing that diagnostic probing process to evaluate the effectiveness of two or more different instructional strategies to verify that we're using the best approach to get the best outcomes for students. So the last strategy we'll talk about under the informal category would be the category of curriculum-based measurement. And curriculum-based measurement is considered a direct assessment technique. It measures the student's current level of skill. And one of the greatest things about curriculum-based measurement is that it measures data, you can collect data with this strategy very frequently. So it's a great strategy to inform instruction. It's a great strategy to monitor response to intervention. We can monitor and measure a child's achievement on very specific skills or sub skills. So we can look at things as sensitive as the child's identification of letters, their letter sound relationships, their ability to read individual words, their ability to read connected text, to perform writing tasks, math tasks, a whole variety of reading, mathematics, and writing skills can be evaluated using curriculum based measurement. So, curriculum based measurement is used very often in response to intervention. It provides a really quick, really accurate measurement of a child's current level of achievement in a very specific skill. It's sensitive to change over time, and we can re administer curriculum based measurement even daily. So it's something that can be administered frequently to monitor change over time and has great usefulness in determining a child's response to intervention or response to instruction. Data from curriculum based measurement is very easily graphed and can show a relationship between a student's achievement and intervention. So, some of the other strategies that we've talked about are strategies that can't be administered nearly as often as curriculum based measurement, or they're strategies that can't be administered time and time again. But curriculum based measurement really is very useful in that context where you need to know information quickly and frequently about a child's performance or achievement in a specific skill. So, again, CBM or curriculum based measurement is kind of the hallmark strategy of gathering information in a response to intervention framework. And it's just a really useful strategy, for those applications that I just mentioned. So this concludes our slideshow for Chapter 5 and our discussion of classroom-based assessment.